Under President Trump's leadership, after decades of disastrous decisions by this nation's self-appointed so-called foreign policy elite, we're once again putting American interests first.
On Friday, President Trump unveiled a national security blueprint in which he describes China as a long-term competitor to the U.S. Hegseth touched on the topic as well. He says Washington isn't aiming to overpower China, but rather defend its own interests.
It's our job to make sure Beijing sees unquestionable U.S. military strength that, if necessary, can back up our national interests. Even as we make clear our peaceful intentions, we insist that, as a Pacific nation ourselves, China respect our long-standing interests in the Indo-Pacific.
He also touched on the issue of America's support for its partners. Hegseth criticizes the fact that previous administrations seem to overly focus on defending partners like Ukraine instead of putting America first.
We will actually, for real, get our allies and partners to step up and do their part. We will no longer tolerate free riding. President Trump has shown the way with his historic leadership that yielded the commitments at NATO's Hague Summit. There, NATO committed to spend 5% of GDP on defense.
The U.S. recently changed its policy on support for Ukraine. Instead of donating weapons directly to Kyiv, Washington now sells them to NATO, which then in turn sends them to Ukraine. President Donald Trump's new national security blueprint states the era of mass migration is over and highlights China as a long-term competitor to the United States. Joining me now to discuss is Kervin Oakwind, former lead intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance coordinator for the U.S. Army. Welcome back, Kervin. What, in your view, has been the impact of mass migration on the United States in recent years? Do we have you, Kervin? Sounds like we might not have Kervin, so we will have to come back to that and move on. President Trump has signed a new executive order. It creates task forces at the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission. Their job? Protect competition in the U.S. food supply chain. The task forces will target anti-competitive behavior. That includes price fixing. The order says some foreign-controlled corporations threaten the U.S. food supply. It also notes that several companies have already settled price-fixing cases for tens of millions of dollars. The order directs the U.S. Attorney General and the FTC chair to set up the new teams. A 7-magnitude major earthquake rocking Alaska on Saturday. That's according to the U.S. Geological Survey. The quake was at a depth of over 6 miles. The earthquake struck near Yakutat, a community in southeastern Alaska, with a population of over 600. No death or injuries have been reported so far, but the tremor was strongly felt in nearby areas of Alaska and Canada. That's according to Austin Holland, Director of Operations of the Alaska Earthquake Center. Holland told USA Today that he expects there would be many aftershocks in the area in the coming days and weeks, and that there is a very small chance that there could be a large earthquake. Next, Japan and Australia are calling for calm after a tense weekend encounter in the skies with a Chinese military jet. Earlier today, both countries urged restraint following what Japan says was an unsafe radar lock. According to Japan's defense ministry, a Chinese J-15 fighter jet took off from the carrier Liaoning near Okinawa. They say the jet repeatedly locked its radar on Japanese F-15s on Saturday. First, for about 3 minutes in the afternoon, and again later that evening for around 30 minutes. Here's Japan's defense minister addressing the incident directly.
This radar lock-on exceeded the scope necessary for the safe flight of aircraft and constituted a dangerous act. We deeply regret that such an incident occurred and have lodged a strong protest with the Chinese side, making a stern demand for measures to prevent recurrence.
Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi called the lock-on extremely disappointing, saying Japan will act calmly but resolutely and continue surveillance around its waters and airspace. Australia's defense minister voiced concerns during talks with his Japanese counterpart, saying it expects safe and professional interactions with China. Both sides agreed to boost military cooperation. Japan says its jets were scrambled only to monitor Chinese drills, while China accuses Japan of harassment, saying the exercises were announced beforehand. This comes amid rising tensions over Taiwan after Prime Minister Takaichi suggested Japan could intervene if China acted against the island. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the region, the Philippines says China fired flares at a patrol aircraft in the South China Sea on Saturday. Donald Trump Jr. criticized corruption in Ukraine and suggested Sunday that his father may walk away from the country if it doesn't make peace with Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday that he had a long and substantive phone call with President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. Here's more.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday he had a long and substantive phone call with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner regarding their push to end Ukraine's war with Russia. Zelensky said on X that they, quote, agreed on the next steps and formats for talks with the United States. Witkoff and Kushner had held 2 days of talks with Ukraine's senior negotiator Rustem Umerov in Miami this week. Both sides called them constructive discussions. Witkoff had been expected to brief Umerov on his meeting in Moscow this week with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Zelensky said he was waiting for Umerov to give him a detailed report in person in Kyiv. This comes as French President Emmanuel Macron said on Saturday he would travel to London on Monday to meet Zelensky as well as British and German leaders to discuss the situation in Ukraine and ongoing negotiations under U.S. mediation. Macron also condemned in the strongest possible terms the strikes that targeted Ukraine Friday night. Zelensky addressed troops and military leaders Saturday on the Day of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Also, he visited a hospital in Kyiv to give out awards to wounded soldiers and medics and thank them for their service.
Coming back to our previous story, President Donald Trump's new national security blueprint states the era of mass migration is over and highlights China as a long-term competitor to the United States. Joining me now to discuss is Kervin Oakland, former lead intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance coordinator for the U.S. Army. Kervin, welcome. It is good to have you back after that. What, in your view, has been the impact of mass migration on the United States in recent years?
Yeah, sorry about that, Chris, and it's so good to see you. Good to be here.
Oh, good.
I would say that it hasn't been the last few years. It's been the last few decades. This has been an issue within the United States. Just the freedom of travel across the borders, mainly the border, our southern border with Mexico. So my first deployment, if I could just tell a brief story here, my first deployment was to Baghdad, Iraq in 2004. One of the first briefings we got out of Fort Hood, Texas was from the FBI talking about the mass migration of terrorist cells through the Mexican border. That was an issue in 2004. That has not gotten fixed. I honestly, there's a lot you can disagree with the administration, and I think that's healthy to disagree with any administration that is doing the wrong thing. But we have got to secure the border for these specific reasons.
Okay, and Kervin, the strategy goes beyond the United States and hints at the need for other nations to follow suit in ending mass migration. What do you think are the biggest obstacles to Trump's apparent aim of ending mass migration worldwide?
Yeah, I think it's the worldwide part of that, right? Well, while the Trump administration is talking America first and being, very internal about things, trying to project power with that, it's going to be quite difficult. The European nations are going to wonder why they are going to agree to things that the United States wants them to do, and the United States isn't going, or says that they're not going to help within Europe anymore. But I think one of the things there is what the Trump administration is trying to do in forcing NATO as a NATO country, forcing other NATO countries to spend that 5% of GDP on defense. I know Germany is working towards that. Other countries are working towards that, but most of NATO is woefully unprepared for what's happening in their borders. And one of the things is that Russia is creeping closer to NATO borders with this war in Ukraine.
And we are seeing rising public sentiment in Europe about more secure borders, about pushing back against mass migration there. But the recently released document states, we want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. Does this explain the U.S. Navy buildup in the Caribbean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Monroe Doctrine 2.0, right? So this is exactly what's happening in the Caribbean. There, it is a show of force, really. Go back to reading The Art of War. You want to win this battle without ever firing a single munition. Well, we fired quite a few munitions, but have not had many fired back at us in this. And I think that's the projection of power that's being shown here. And it starts with Venezuela, it moves to Colombia, and it shows the Latin American countries that the United States is not going to sit idly by while terrorist organizations, while drug traffickers are able to move at will. And another part of this is, look, China is in Latin America as well, and they have a free flow of movement in Latin America, facilitating this drug movement, specifically fentanyl, into the United States.
Now, my colleague Blanquita Cullum, who used to be on the board of governors for U.S. foreign media in the United States, said that when she was in Venezuela reporting on Chavez, she saw billboards sponsored by the Iranian regime there. What kind of presence do America's adversaries have in South America that could be perhaps deterred by this presence?
Yeah, absolutely right. So we've got it's just like the Axis and the Allies again, right? So Iran is heavy in Latin America. China has a heavy influence in Latin America through their Belt and Road Initiative. Russia is supplying munitions, not as much anymore with their war in Ukraine, but they are providing energy. They're providing intelligence. And so you've got this axis, right, that we're always talking about: Russia, Iran, China, and they are very influential in the Caribbean. Let's not forget that the Panama Canal, both sides of that port, have ports that are owned by Chinese companies, with the Golden Percent that's owned by the Chinese Communist Party, of the CCP. If China would direct those companies to block the Panama Canal, they would do so, and the United States would have a very difficult time traversing this free flow of naval waters.
Kervin, you've created the perfect segue to my next question. A key focus of this national security strategy is China, stating America's economic openness toward China did not influence it toward freedom and neighborliness as the policy had intended. What went wrong?
I'm sorry. Again, what? I guess I don't know. Question of what went
wrong.
It's
okay. So what went wrong in the past 30, 40 years with U.S. policy towards China, hoping that trade would influence China toward neighborliness?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely right. So what went wrong? Let me throw that back onto China. I'll tell you what went wrong: the theft of U.S. intelligence, the theft of naval assets, so that they can build their own naval assets. Not this free flow of information. No, their aircraft carriers are built as a direct replica of U.S. air carriers because of the engine that was split. So China owns the responsibility there. They have not been good stewards of world freedom, and now they're with all of this influx in cash flow in this in the world today. They are trying to prop themselves up as some benevolent global power, which they aren't. They are thieves. That the Belt and Road Initiative has showed us that with emerging economies, they are stealing from the rest of the world, namely the African continent and the resources there. They are not providing for the African continent. They're just stealing resources.
Kervin, Trump's China policy is heavily focused on economic reciprocity, seeming to take a sort of live and let live stance, calling China a competitor. But China, of course, seeks overall dominance over the U.S. and the world. What do you make of the tension between these differing positions?
Yeah, it's actually in parallel with what I've seen in the U.S. military and in my time in the Department of War. With what I'm saying is that as I started out, I signed up September or October 16th of 2001. China was seen as a competitor. 10 years into that, they were seen as an adversary. That then became a near peer, and as we stand today, that the U.S. and the U.S. military determines that China is a peer on peer, right? So if we get into a large scale combat operation, we are dealing with another peer. This is something that we have not faced, since Nazi Germany, right? Not to say one side's Nazis, one side's the free world, but we are in a war that no one has participated in, and we are losing, our grandparents and our great grandparents who have fought in those wars to even understand how to win that.
Kervin, just in closing here, overall, how does this national security strategy compare to the same from prior administrations?
I think it's a lot more political for sure, but we know that's how the administration works right now. A heavy emphasis on our borders and staying internal, the America First policy, but heavy-handed towards China, I think. And look, I think there is. I know a lot of the media is running with how Russia is not really mentioned in here. I read through it. You know what Russia is mentioned as? Not even a competitor. Russia is an afterthought, because they showed their hand in the invasion of Ukraine, right? They used to be seen as a near peer to the United States. The United States does not consider them a near peer anymore, and they say, Europe, deal with it. This is on your borders. This is on your continent. You need to deal with it.
Kervin Oakman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Stay safe out there.
You too. Coming up, the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean, according to experts, is not large enough to topple the Venezuelan regime. A Marine Corps veteran and attorney weighs in on the reasons for the presence after the break.